I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I am surrounded by the best smelling flower in the world, in my opinion. This is Daphne odora, or winter Daphne, and it is in full bloom. So if I swoon in the middle of this broadcast, you'll know why. Today, I'm reading Chapter 4 from my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. And this is the final chapter in the first section, Pieces of Slave. For those of you excited about the last chapter, White Slavery, calm down. I am not in this chapter going into woke white guilt. I don't believe in that. What I'm looking at, however, is how all of us are trapped in a system where slavery exists for anyone. Let's look at this. From Ursula K. Le Guin. Whiteness crossed the continent, a poison fog, and where it went, villages were vacant hearths and ways forsaken. Whiteness with greed and iron makes the deep seas barren. Great migrations fly day long into whiteness and are gone. And from Gaston Martin, there was not a single great shipowner at Nantes who, between 1714 and 1789, did not buy and sell slaves. There was not one who sold only slaves. It is almost as certain that none would have become what he was if he had not sold slaves. In this lies the essential importance of the slave trade. On its success or failure depended the progress or ruin of all the others. In the 18th century, the complexion of slavery changed, and a tidal wave of African slaves engulfed the Irish, who were washed into the forgotten backwaters of history. All pretense of temporary captivity was dropped, along with the flimsy rhetoric of Christian-to-Christian forbearance. From 1450 to 1600, only 3% of the eventual number of African slaves had been abducted. While the 17th century added another 16%, the Middle Passage reached its moral nadir in the 18th century when the majority of African enslavement occurred. It was to eventually reach 100 million people. And remember again that the 18th century is when the word Jew was first coined. The purpose of this chapter is to examine Black slavery as a racialized version of capitalism, in which a handful of people profit by exploiting the labor of all the others. The race of the handful doesn't matter. What matters is that they are a handful, and the rest of us all started out on the same side. In Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams makes the point that white servitude in the fields prepared the way for Black slavery in the fields, which then enabled white servitude in the factories. In How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Walter Rodney echoes the link between slavery and capitalism by quoting Marx. The discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the turning of Africa into a commercial warrant for the hunting of Black skins, signalized the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. The abduction of Africans has been coined the transatlantic slave trade. However, Rodney questions whether trade even applies. He writes, "On the whole, the process by which captives were obtained on African soil was not trade at all. It was through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. When one tries to measure the effect of European slave trading on the African continent, it is essential to realize that one is measuring the effect of social violence rather than trade in any normal sense of the word." Short-circuiting the circuit myth. The confusion between expropriation and trade is even more evident in the term triangular slave trade. According to the myth, guns, goods, and trinkets were given to bounty hunters in exchange for African slaves. The slaves were taken to the Caribbean, where they were unloaded to make room for sugar and molasses. The sugar was brought to England or to New England, where it was made into rum. The rum was then bartered for more guns and goods to take back to Africa to trade for more slaves. But in truth, no single ship is known to have made this full circuit. Ships designed for the horrific Middle Passage weren't suited for molasses or sugar. Instead, the maritime vessels departed Africa with people wedged into living coffins and returned filled with incidentals and mere ballast, plus a trunk of silver and gold for the speculators who had funded the journey. The guns enabled the abduction of people, whose forced labor created sugar, tea, coffee, tobacco, and liquor. These substances, all addictive, enabled the English working class to bear a stultifying life in the military or in the factories. The latter produced the clothes, goods, and guns that enticed the slave hunters in Africa. Ready-made fashion and finery also put colonial plantation owners in debt, which they could only escape through greater productivity, more land, and more slaves. At the top of this pyramid of profit, wielding a ledger instead of a whip, were the invisible few who reaped the greatest rewards at the lowest risk to themselves, the capitalists and bankers. Without the creation of impersonal, transcontinental money in the form of precious metals, the nightmare of slave extraction could never have happened. Barter, no matter how large the circle, would not have enabled it. Plantation owners are seen as slavery's greatest villains, but the financiers, who merely issued tradable bills against the treasure in their safe vault, enabled ownership of ships, guns, and goods that eventually returned as more gold and silver. Concentrated and imperishable forms of money were necessary to debase the precious metal of humanity. And I will also point out that cryptocurrencies are another impersonal, anonymous kind of money that is concentrated and imperishable. Spreading the guilt. Meanwhile, in England, the glorious revolution of 1688 that dethroned the Stuarts broke the slave transport monopoly of the Royal African Company. By 1698, slave ships operated as an open stock market for small investors, with free trade in slaves seen as the fundamental right of Englishmen. Business boomed with new speculators pouring in. Where the Royal African Company had transported around 5,000 slaves a year, 2 million slaves were taken annually to British colonies between 1680 and 1786 at a fourfold increase. Free trade took precedence even when it undermined British dominance. Spain adhered to the papal decree to not engage directly in slave trafficking, which didn't prohibit them from buying slaves already transported. The privileged contract to supply these slaves was called the asiento. Withholding slaves from Spain would have eliminated the competition in slave-grown products, allowing British plantations to get a better price. Against this, it was argued that Spain paid in silver, which enriched the bullion available in England. Due to the resulting competition, any cost savings for British planters only lasted a year or two before the drop in the price of goods left them more dependent than before. Liverpool became the foremost port for slave vessels in the world. It went from its first ship in 1709 to hosting 3/7 of all European slave fleets in 1795. Although 10 companies owned most of the ships, every profession in Liverpool had a piece of the action, whether supplying them, outfitting them, or investing in them. Many of the small vessels in the trade were fitted out by attorneys, drapers, grocers, barbers, and tailors. The shares in the venture were subdivided, one having 1/8, another 1/15, a third 1/32 part of a share, and so on. Almost every order of people is interested in a guinea cargo. It is to this influenza that there are so many small ships. The investment carried considerable risk, however, of mortality on board or the whole ship going down, since 1 in 5 miscarried. Moreover, the planters were heavily in debt and often needed long credit from the ship owners, during which time they might go bankrupt. When the slave ships did make a profit, it was modest for a high-risk gamble. An 18th century estimate puts the combined annual profit at just over 30%, compared to the 5,000% low-risk profit garnered in spices by the Dutch East India Company. But the spice trade was tightly controlled to keep production low and prices high, whereas the slave trade distributed the risks and the profits widely. This had the effect of creating many small investors who were hostile to the abolitionist. Abolition threatened the jobs and investments supplied by slavery and the products, particularly sugar, on which common people had come to depend. The government and merchants encouraged this animosity. In 1708, the British Board of Trade proclaimed it absolutely necessary that a trade so beneficial to the kingdom should be carried on to the greatest advantage. Sometimes the crackpots win. But toward the end of the 18th century, in 1787, 12 innocuous-seeming men met in a London print shop. They were to change the trajectory of history in 5 short years. Adam Hochschild's book, Bury the Chains, tells the story. If early that year you had stood on a London street corner and insisted that slavery was morally wrong and should be stopped, 9 out of 10 listeners would have laughed you off as a crackpot. The 10th might have agreed with you in principle, but assured you that ending slavery was wildly impractical. The British Empire's economy would collapse. Within a few short years, however, there was an abolition committee in every major city or town. More than 300,000 Britons were refusing to eat slave-grown sugar. Parliament was flooded with far more signatures on abolition petitions than it had ever received on any other subject. And in 1792, the House of Commons passed the first law banning the slave trade. Ending slavery, however, was easier decreed than done. Plantation owners in the colonies were in favor of ending new shipments of slaves, which would increase their monopoly and the sale price of slaves from their breeding programs. Smallholders, on the other hand, wanted a more democratic distribution of slave labor by being able to buy direct from the boat. So even within the group of slave owners, they were divided by class, with cessation of the slave trade favoring the more established large plantation masters. The pyramid of plantocracy. In effect, therefore, European colonialism echoed the plantocracy of ancient Greece, expanded to mean that a few claimed ownership of the land and granted use of it to some, who then added to the wealth of a few through conquest and enslavement of the rest. At the top were those who might be called archons, the very wealthy financiers who owned the precious metals on which the economy turned. At the bottom, most certainly, were the African slaves. But in between, everyone else was both trapped by the system and benefited from it. Laborers without land couldn't hope to earn enough money to buy their own plots. A free man couldn't compete with slave labor by using his own or a few hired hands. Plus, plantations had driven up the price for available land. As subsistence producers, they were doomed, but as consumers, they could obtain food, clothing, and goods without doing manual labor. The smallholder farms, who were unable to hire free men, also couldn't compete with the self-sufficiency of plantations. Slave owners who wanted to keep their slaves busy in the off-season grew corn and pork for the local market, in addition to their cash crop, and trained their own blacksmiths and craftsmen. Therefore, smallholders had to either get big or get out. Owners of only a few slaves were at a particular disadvantage after imports of new slaves ended. However, the smallholder did have a fallback. He could sell his land to the plantations. This would enable his sons to go to college and become accountants or lawyers, serving the slave owners. Or he could use the money to speculate in the import-export market of slave-grown goods. Even the plantation owners themselves were trapped by their debt to the merchants and slave ships. Margins were kept tight by competition with other colonies. Just one unprofitable season from illness or misfortune, from a flood or a drought, from runaway slaves or a full revolt, and the family fortune would be lost. Many men of reputation ended their lives in suicide rather than face imprisonment and shame. Once precious metals were made into the measure of land, labor, and lives, everything that happened since was bound to follow. No one could change the ways in which they were servants without addressing the ways in which they were masters. And none could renounce their privilege entirely without a country that did the same. That was the logic of abolitionists in England. Blood for soil. When England abolished slavery at home, of course, they didn't stop the import of slave-made products. The undermining of free labor continued for the British working class, but in a less obvious form. Money now didn't buy whole slaves, but it still bought pieces of slave, forced labor in a commodified form available from the local dry goods shop or confectionery. Slave labor still backed the money, no matter how the English worker earned it. The difference between the places where slavery persisted and where slavery died out may say less about the character of the people and more about the availability of soil. Williams explains, according to Adam Smith, the prosperity of a new colony depends upon one simple economic factor: plenty of good land. The British colonial possessions up to 1776, however, can be broadly divided into two types. The first is the self-sufficient and diversified economy of small farmers, mere earth-scratchers, as Gibbon Wakefield derisively called them. The second type is the colony, which has facilities for the production of staple articles on a large scale for an export market. In colonies of the latter type, land and capital were both useless unless labor could be commanded. In such colonies, the rugged individualism of the Massachusetts farmer, practicing his intensive agriculture and wringing by the sweat of his brow niggardly returns from a grudging soil, must yield to the disciplined gang of the big capitalists practicing extensive agriculture and producing on a large scale. He quotes Wakefield that the reasons for slavery are not moral, but economical circumstances. They relate not to vice and virtue, but to production. However, slavery has its own limits. He writes, from the standpoint of the grower, the greatest defect of slavery lies in the fact that it quickly exhausts the soil. The labor supply of low social status, docile and cheap, can be maintained in subjection only by systematic degradation and by deliberate efforts to suppress its intelligence. Rotation of crops and the scientific farming are therefore alien to slave societies. As Jefferson wrote of Virginia, we can buy an acre of new land cheaper than we can manure an old one. The slave planter, in the picturesque nomenclature of the South, is a land killer. Expansion is a necessity of slave societies. The slave power requires ever fresh conquest. Therefore, the theft of land from Aboriginal people was part and parcel of the theft of people from their lands. Without the former, the latter could not have existed, at least on the commonplace scale that it did. And without the latter, in other words, if immigrants had been mere earth scratchers, tilling and manuring their own small plots of dirt, instead of slave owners and colonizers, our history might have been different. Races living together in peace with respect for each other and the land. It was not immigration, but forced migration that created animosity between white, black, and red. Now I'm back inside where it is warm and quiet, but I have a mere sprig of my winter Daphne. Every chapter ends in exercises because these are designed for students. And in this one, I explain the paradigm shift that happened in this chapter. It isn't possible to compete with slavery. As long as the products of slave labor are on the market, no free person can make an honest living by farming or producing, because the only way to obtain a livable income is by serving the slave-owning class. Moreover, speculation in the peripheral functions of slave owning, such as commerce, becomes a necessity for middle-class security. Greed becomes survival. And then I look at a lexicon and explain different terms, and then I look at questions for discussion and reflection. And one of those is, if axial ages are defined as the 500 years before and after the turn of a millennia, we would be in the middle of the third axial age. In the first centuries of this axial age, those who really ruled the empires were the merchant bankers, to whom the kings and queens were indebted. Royalty was the face of privilege and ran the risks of public uprisings, including beheadings, but the merchant bankers bore the least risk and reaped the greatest rewards. In today's world, these would be the executive board members, bank owners, and venture capitalists, who are often the same people in different roles, making up the shadow government. Is there a word or a phrase to describe them? If not, how does it affect our ability to see them, discuss them, much less target them? What name would you coin to encapsulate them? And as a hint, these are 1 in a million or 100 million, not the 1%. And for more, here is Chapter 3, White Slavery, and Chapter 2, Making a Market for Plunder. Thank you for watching.